Before we start, I need to let you know this story touches on sensitive topics, including complicated family dynamics, blurred boundaries, and secrecy. If themes like emotional entanglement and betrayal make you uncomfortable, this may not be the story for you. You know how sometimes you walk into a situation, and you can feel it shift the air? That heavy, almost magnetic pull you can't explain but also can't resist? That's what it felt like the day I got back to my Grandpa Weston's house. It was only 2 weeks. 14 days spent with my parents, pretending my life was perfectly normal. I smiled through dinners, told them how great school was, and dodged questions about dating. My mom's over-the-shoulder glances at my outfits and my dad's polite distance felt like reminders that I didn't fully belong there anymore. Not like I used to. But when the cab pulled up in front of Weston's house, I felt it, relief mixed with nerves. This wasn't just me coming home to a safe place. It was more complicated than that. I stepped out, brushing invisible wrinkles from my white sundress, the kind that flutters just enough to turn heads. It was too short for family dinners and too fitted to feel casual. That was kind of the point. I wanted him to notice me. The AC repairman's truck was still in the driveway. I didn't think much of it until the front door opened, and Weston stood there, talking to a guy in coveralls. The repairman glanced over his shoulder, eyes landing on me for half a second too long. He smiled, polite but curious, and stepped aside to let me in. Weston's voice pulled me in before I even crossed the threshold. "There's my girl," he said, like I'd been gone for months instead of days. He didn't hug me, but he stood close enough that I caught the scent of his aftershave. My heart stuttered, and I hated that it did. "Got everything fixed?" I asked, glancing toward the air conditioner. I tried to sound casual, but my voice came out lighter than I meant it to. "Yep," Weston said, but he wasn't looking at the AC. His eyes were locked on mine, then dropped to the neckline of my dress, before snapping back up. He smiled, easy but deliberate, and I felt it everywhere. The repairman cleared his throat, reminding us both he was still there. Weston stepped back just enough to let him pass, but not enough to break the tension. "Let me grab my toolbox," the guy said, disappearing down the hall. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Weston's gaze lingered a moment longer before he reached for my suitcase. "Leave that," I said quickly. "I'll unpack later." He set it down without argument. I followed him into the living room, where the curtains were half drawn, letting soft afternoon light spill across the sofa. It felt too quiet, like the house had been holding its breath while I was gone. Weston settled onto the couch, and I perched on the armrest, smoothing the hem of my dress out of habit. I saw his eyes track the movement. It wasn't the first time I caught him looking. I'd noticed it months ago, but back then, I brushed it off. An accidental glance here, a harmless comment there. But harmless didn't explain the way he lingered now, like he was daring me to notice. I did notice. I'd noticed ever since I moved in and started borrowing his sweaters when it got cold. I noticed when he left notes in my lunch bag like I was still in middle school. And I definitely noticed the way he touched my arm a second too long when he passed by me in the kitchen. It had started slow, little things I could ignore until I didn't want to ignore them anymore. I told myself it was because he made me feel safe, like someone who always had my back. He'd taken me in, given me a place to focus on school, and never complained when I needed help. Maybe I owed him more than gratitude. Maybe I liked the attention. That thought hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I looked away, pretending to fiddle with the straps of my purse. "So," I said, "what did you do while I was gone?" His smile softened. "Counted down the days." I laughed, but it felt shaky. He didn't. The sound of footsteps broke the moment, and the repairman reappeared, toolbox in hand. He gave us a quick nod. "Thanks for waiting," he said. "I'll let myself out." Weston stood and followed him to the door. I stayed on the couch, pretending to scroll through my phone but mostly just listening. The repairman said something I couldn't make out, and Weston laughed, a deep, easy sound that always made people like him instantly. The door clicked shut, and Weston returned, his face unreadable. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," he said. It wasn't the words that got me. It was the way he said them, like we were in on something no one else could understand. I swallowed hard and stood, trying to shake the weight pressing down on me. "I should unpack." Weston stepped aside but didn't move far. His hand brushed mine as I passed. I told myself it wasn't intentional. I knew it was. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was halfway down the hall, headed to my room, when I heard Weston's voice drifting in from the front porch. "She's coming back today," he said, and there was this lift in his tone, like he couldn't wait, like the last 2 weeks had stretched him too thin. "Gotta make sure the place is perfect for her." I froze. My fingers curled tighter around the handle of my suitcase, but I didn't move. Sterling's voice came next, casual but curious. "Granddaughter, right?" "Yeah," Weston said, quick enough to feel rehearsed. "She's been visiting her parents. Just finished her finals." "Smart kid." I should have walked away, but I stayed rooted to the floor. Maybe it was the way Weston said it, like he was proud, but there was something else buried under the words. Something that made my stomach tighten. Sterling didn't respond right away. I pictured him nodding, thinking it over, deciding whether to press further. "That's nice," he finally said, but his voice dipped at the end, like it wasn't just small talk anymore. I took a step back, trying to make it to my room without being noticed. But as I turned, the front door creaked, and suddenly Sterling was there, toolbox in hand, eyes locking on mine. I stopped. So did he. For a second, no one spoke. His gaze dropped, flicking briefly to the dress I'd barely adjusted after sitting on the couch. Then Weston stepped in behind him, and the moment passed. "You'll have to excuse her," Weston said with that easy laugh of his. "Long flight." Sterling didn't laugh. His eyes lingered just long enough to make me wonder what he saw, or thought he saw, before he nodded and walked past me. But as he did, I caught the faintest trace of a smirk. Not friendly. Not polite. Just knowing. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit. The door shut, but the sound felt louder than it should have, like it sealed something in instead of keeping something out. Weston didn't move right away. He stood by the window, peeking through the curtain as Sterling's truck rumbled down the driveway. I stayed planted in the middle of the living room, still clutching the handle of my suitcase even though my arm was starting to ache. I thought he'd say something about Sterling. Maybe a joke to brush off the tension I knew we both felt. But when Weston finally turned, his eyes didn't go to the door. They went straight to me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The heat in my chest flared up so fast it caught me off guard, and I had to look away. My fingers fumbled with the buckle of my bag as I forced myself to move, to break whatever that moment was before it went too far. "I should unpack," I said, not looking at him. But before I could leave, I felt his hand brush my arm. Soft. Quick. Like he wasn't sure if he should or if I'd pull away. I didn't. That was the problem. I never did. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like this was the first time. I could still remember the first time. It was a few months after I'd moved in. I was sitting at the kitchen table, stressed out about a paper that wasn't coming together. Weston had come up behind me and started rubbing my shoulders, just trying to calm me down, or at least that's what I thought. But then his hands drifted lower, just for a second. I froze, and he pulled back like it was nothing. "Sorry," he said, laughing it off. "You're just so tense." And I let it go. Because he'd been there when no one else was. When I didn't know how I was going to afford rent, and my parents said moving home wasn't an option. When I broke up with my boyfriend and spent 2 days crying, and Weston was the one who brought me soup and sat with me until I felt human again. I let it go when he started complimenting me more, how I looked, how I carried myself, how proud he was of me. I let it go when he started sitting closer on the couch. I let it go when he kissed my forehead one night, then my cheek, and lingered just a little too long. Because it felt good. Because no one had looked at me like that in a long time, and I didn't want to admit how much I missed it. And because part of me didn't believe it was wrong until it was too late. I snapped back to the present when Weston's hand slid down to my wrist. Not tight. Just enough to make me stop. You don't have to rush, he said, his voice low. We've got time. I swallowed hard. I knew I should pull away. I should have stepped back, picked up my bag, and put space between us. But instead, I stood there, feeling that same pull I'd felt the first time I let him cross the line. And the worst part? I wanted him to. Before we dive into this part of the story, if you're still here and completely locked in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to it. Weston sat on the couch, leaning back like he didn't have a care in the world. But I knew better. The way his eyes followed me as I moved around the room gave him away. I was pretending to organize my things, folding clothes that didn't need folding, smoothing out wrinkles that weren't really there. Anything to keep my hands busy. But Weston wasn't having it. Come sit down, he said, patting the cushion next to him. You've been gone too long for all this. I hesitated. My pulse jumped, and I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just nerves. But the weight of his words made my feet feel heavier as I crossed the room. I didn't sit right next to him. Not at first. But Weston reached out and tugged me closer like it was the most natural thing in the world. His arm draped across the back of the couch, and his fingers brushed my shoulder. You look different, he said, his eyes dipping lower before coming back up. I swallowed. Different how? More grown up. His voice dropped. Beautiful. The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I forced a laugh, but it cracked. I was only gone 2 weeks. Felt longer. His hand grazed my shoulder again, this time trailing down to the strap of my dress. He caught it between his fingers, straightening it like it needed adjusting. My breath caught. It was nothing, just fixing a strap. That's what I told myself. That's what I wanted to believe. But it didn't feel like nothing. Weston tilted his head, watching me too closely. I missed you, he said softly. I didn't know what to say to that. Or maybe I did, but I was too afraid to say it out loud. Before I could figure it out, the front door swung open. It wasn't loud, but it hit me like a gunshot. I jerked back so fast, my dress strap slipped down my arm. Weston tensed beside me, but he didn't move. And there was Sterling, standing in the doorway with his toolbox in one hand and something unreadable in his expression. For a second, no one said anything. Sterling's eyes darted between us. My strap hanging loose, Weston's hand still too close, the flush in my cheeks I couldn't hide. His brows knit together, and I knew. He saw it. Whatever this thing was, whatever I'd been trying to pretend wasn't happening, he saw it. Sterling shifted his weight, clearing his throat like that might make this less awkward. Sorry, he said, lifting the toolbox. Left this behind. Weston finally moved, standing up and stepping between us like he could physically block whatever Sterling was thinking. No problem, he said, too casual. Glad you caught it before you left. But Sterling didn't look at him. He looked at me. It wasn't judgment in his eyes. Not exactly. It was worse. It was recognition. Like he knew what was happening but wasn't sure if he wanted to believe it. My heart pounded. I wanted to say something, to explain, to brush it off, to make him look away, but the words stuck. Sterling lingered, like he was waiting for one of us to crack. Then, finally, he took a step back. Well, he said, hope you enjoy the rest of your day. The way he said it made my stomach twist. Like it wasn't just small talk. Like it was a question without asking one. Weston waited until the door shut behind him before turning back to me. His jaw was tight. "Don't worry about him," he said, but his voice was sharp, not reassuring. I didn't believe him. My head spun, replaying the look on Sterling's face, the way his eyes lingered, the hesitation in his voice. He knew. And if he knew, then what? I felt Weston's hand on my arm again, grounding me and trapping me all at once. "Hey," he said, softer now. "You're fine. We're fine." But I wasn't so sure anymore. I sat on the couch, knees pulled up to my chest, staring at the front door like Sterling might come back any second. My stomach wouldn't settle. It twisted and flipped until I thought I might be sick. Weston stood near the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. He let it fall and turned toward me. "He's gone," he said, like that was supposed to fix everything. But it didn't. I shook my head, hugging my knees tighter. "He knows." My voice cracked, and I hated how small I sounded. "You saw the way he looked at us." Weston crossed the room in 2 steps, kneeling in front of me. His hands went to my legs, firm but gentle, like he could hold me together if he just held on tight enough. "Look at me," he said. I didn't want to, but I did. "He doesn't know anything," Weston said, his voice low and steady. He saw what he wanted to see, and that's it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly, I almost let myself. But the image of Sterling standing in that doorway wouldn't leave my head. What if he tells someone? I whispered. Weston shook his head. No one's going to listen to him. Who's going to believe some handyman over us? I bit my lip. But nothing. Weston cut me off. His grip on my legs tightened just enough to make me notice. "You're my granddaughter. That's what people see. That's all they see." The words felt cold. Final. But the worst part was that they worked. The knot in my stomach loosened, just a little, and my breathing slowed. Weston saw it happen and softened his tone. "You're safe," he said. "With me, you're always safe." I let out a shaky breath, leaning into his touch without meaning to. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like he'd do anything to protect me. Like I mattered more than anyone else ever had. And that's what scared me the most. Because as much as I wanted to pull away, I didn't. I couldn't. The sound of my phone vibrating jolted me out of it. I grabbed it off the coffee table and saw my mom's name flashing across the screen. I froze. Weston's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to me. "Answer it," he said. I hesitated, but I swiped to accept the call and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hey, Mom." Her voice came through sharp and concerned. "You made it back okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly. Too quickly. "Got here a couple hours ago." There was a pause. "You sound off." I forced a laugh. "I'm just tired from the flight. That's all." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you sure?" she asked. Because I was thinking about something earlier, and maybe it's nothing, but, she trailed off, and my throat went dry. "But what?" Mom exhaled. "I don't know. It's just, Dad and I were talking about Grandpa earlier, and, look, I know you two have gotten close since you moved in, but I worry about how much you're leaning on him." I stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing bad," she said quickly. "I just mean, he's always had a way of making people depend on him, and sometimes it's not healthy." I felt Weston's eyes on me. I turned away, pressing the phone tighter to my ear. "I'm fine," I said. "We're fine." "You're sure?" Mom's voice softened. "Because if you ever need to come home, the door's always open." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I know." The words felt heavier than they should have. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down, my hands trembling. Weston reached out, brushing my hair back from my face. "What did she want?" I shook my head. Nothing. He didn't press, but the look in his eyes said he didn't believe me. And as much as I wanted to convince myself I was still in control, I could feel it slipping away. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, but it made me jump anyway. My stomach sank before I even turned around. Weston wasn't home. He'd gone to pick up groceries, which meant I was alone. And the knock came again, 3 quick raps this time, sharper, like whoever was out there wasn't planning to leave. I forced myself to the door and opened it just enough to see who it was. Sterling. He stood there, toolbox in hand, but something about his expression made my chest tighten. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even pretending to be casual. "Sorry to bother you," he said, but his voice was flat. "Just need to finish up a few things with the unit." I wanted to tell him no, that now wasn't a good time, but my words wouldn't come out. Instead, I stepped aside, and he brushed past me without waiting for an invitation. He set his toolbox down and crouched near the vent, fiddling with the screws. But his eyes kept flicking up at me, and the silence stretched until it felt unbearable. "You okay?" he asked finally, not looking at me this time. I froze. "What?" He tightened one of the screws, his jaw tense. "You just seem—" "I don't know. Nervous." I forced a laugh, but it sounded thin. "I'm fine." He looked up then, really looked at me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. "You sure?" he asked. And there it was. The question hanging between us, the one he wasn't really asking out loud but was begging me to answer. I swallowed hard and shifted my weight. "It's just been a long week." Sterling didn't break eye contact. "I get that," he said, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe me. "You know, if there's something you need to talk about, I'm here." I almost did it. I almost let everything spill out right there. But then I thought about Weston, about his voice in my head, telling me I was safe with him. That no one would believe anything else. And I panicked. I stepped back, shaking my head. "I'm good," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Really? Thanks, though." Sterling's mouth opened like he wanted to push, but then he closed it again. He nodded, muttered something about needing to get back to work, and turned away. But as he packed up his tools and walked out the door, I saw it in his face. He didn't believe me. Later that night, I was on my bed, scrolling through my phone and pretending I wasn't still replaying that conversation in my head, when my screen lit up with a call. "Kobe." I almost ignored it. But part of me needed the distraction, so I answered. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. "Finally," Kobe said, half laughing. "You've been impossible to reach. What's going on with you?" I felt my chest tighten again. "Nothing. Just busy." "Busy?" Kobe scoffed. "You ghosted me for 2 weeks. Don't give me that." I tried to laugh it off, but it fell flat. "I'm serious. School, family, everything's just been a lot." Kobe was quiet for a second, and I thought maybe I'd gotten away with it. But then he spoke again, softer this time. "Is this about Weston?" I froze. "What?" "You heard me," Kobe said. "You've been weird ever since you moved in with him. And don't say it's nothing, because I know you, Journey. You're different. Jumpy. Like you're hiding something." I felt the panic rising again, bubbling under my skin until it felt like I might explode. "I'm fine," I snapped, too sharp, too fast. "Journey," I said, "I'm fine." The silence that followed was worse than anything he could have said. I felt the tears stinging my eyes, but I wouldn't let them fall. "Not now." "Look, I've gotta go," I said, and I hung up before Kobe could say anything else. I dropped my phone on the bed and buried my face in my hands. I knew I was unraveling. And the worst part? I didn't know how to stop it. The night felt heavier than usual. Weston was sitting in his armchair, flipping through the news, but I couldn't focus. My mind was stuck on Sterling's face, on Kobe's voice echoing in my head. I sat curled up on the couch, my legs tucked beneath me, pretending to scroll through my phone. But Weston noticed. He always noticed. "You're quiet," he said, not looking up from the TV. I forced a shrug. "Just tired." "Is that all?" His voice had shifted, lower, sharper. I hated how quickly it made my stomach flip. "Yeah," I said. But it didn't sound convincing, not even to me. Weston muted the TV and turned to face me. His eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly the room felt too small. "Talk to me." I froze. "About what?" "You've been acting different ever since Sterling came back." I swallowed hard. "I'm fine." "Journey." He said my name like it was a warning, and something in me snapped. "What if he tells someone?" I blurted out. Weston's face darkened. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and stared at me so hard it felt like he could see straight through me. "He won't." "But what if he does?" My voice was rising now, shaky and panicked. "What if he already has?" "What if—" "Stop." I flinched. Weston stood up and crossed the room, towering over me. His presence was suffocating, but I couldn't look away. "Listen to me," he said, each word sharp and deliberate. "No one's going to believe him. Do you hear me? No one." I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off. "You think he's going to go around telling people he saw a girl sitting too close to her grandpa? That's all it was. That's all it looked like." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But the panic wouldn't let go. "What if?" "There is no what if." Weston's voice softened, but his eyes didn't. "He's not going to ruin this for us. I won't let him." The way he said it, calm, steady, certain, made my chest tighten. I nodded, but it wasn't enough for him. He stepped closer, his hand brushing my arm, then gripping it just a little too tight. "You trust me, don't you?" The words came out like a challenge. I swallowed hard and forced myself to meet his eyes. "Yes." And I hated myself for how easy the lie felt. But the night didn't end there. Hours later, I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, when my phone buzzed. I reached for it, my heart pounding as soon as I saw the name. Kobe. I almost ignored it again. But something inside me, guilt, maybe, made me answer. "Journey?" His voice was quieter this time. "What?" I whispered back, keeping my voice low. "You need to tell me what's going on." I closed my eyes. "Nothing's going on." "Stop lying to me." I flinched. "You think I don't see it?" he said, his voice breaking. "You think I don't know what it looks like when someone's scared?" I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. "I can't talk about this right now." "You can't, or you won't?" Tears burned my eyes, but I wouldn't let them fall. "Please," Kobe said. "Just, let me help you." For half a second, I almost said it. Almost let the words spill out. But then Weston's voice came back in my head, steady, certain, unshakable. "You trust me, don't you?" I couldn't do it. "I'm fine," I whispered, and hung up. And as I lay there in the dark, I knew I'd just made everything worse. Before we get into the final part of this story, I want to hear from you. What do you think Journey should do? Should she walk away for good, or is there more to this story that hasn't been uncovered yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has kept you hooked so far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now let's finish this. I stood in the doorway with my suitcase in one hand and my phone in the other. The air felt thick, and every breath I took felt heavier than the last. Weston leaned against the wall, arms crossed, but he didn't look angry. Not this time. He looked scared. "Are you sure about this?" His voice was quiet, almost careful, like he thought the wrong words might shatter me. I wasn't sure. Not at all. But I nodded anyway. It's just for a little while, I said, even though we both knew that wasn't true. He stepped closer, and for a second, I thought he was going to reach out and stop me. But he didn't. I don't want you to go, he said, and his voice cracked just enough to make my stomach twist. I swallowed hard, gripping the handle of my suitcase tighter. I have to. He nodded, but his eyes said something else. The silence stretched until it was too much, so I turned and walked out the door, before I could change my mind. The cab ride felt longer than it should have. My phone buzzed a couple of times, but I didn't check it. I didn't want to know if it was Weston. When I finally made it to my parents' house, the place felt smaller than I remembered, like it didn't quite fit anymore. Mom hugged me at the door, but her eyes were scanning my face the whole time, searching for something I wasn't ready to give her. Dad barely looked up from the TV. I went straight to my old room and shut the door. I sat on the bed and stared at my phone. Weston's name was still at the top of my texts, but that wasn't the one that made my chest tighten. It was Sterling's. The draft sat there, untouched, but glaring at me. I'd typed it 2 nights ago, when the panic was too much. It wasn't long, just a few words asking if he could keep what he saw to himself. I hovered over the send button, my heart pounding, but something stopped me. Sending it meant admitting there was something to hide. It meant giving him power. I couldn't do it. I hit delete, and the screen went blank. But the knot in my stomach didn't go away. I stared at the phone for a long time, half hoping it would buzz again, half terrified that it would. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Now it's your turn, what do you think happens next? Does Journey stay away, or does Weston pull her back in? Should Sterling step in, or will Journey keep running from the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep these stories going. Can't wait to hear what you all think.